There are nights in California's long-forgotten past that seem to breathe on their own, carrying a quiet heaviness that sunlight can never fully erase. In the late 1970s, behind neatly trimmed lawns and warm suburban lights, something darker moved silently between the walls. It lingered in locked rooms, in unspoken fears, and in the uneasy feeling that someone was always watching. This is the story of an unsolved mystery that stretched far beyond its decade, drifting into the collective memory as a cold case that refused to fade. For years, the truth seemed unreachable, dissolved into rumor, trauma, and unanswered questions. Families carried their grief in silence, while investigators chased shadows that kept slipping away. Not until 2018 did a fragment of DNA rise from the archives, whispering a name long hidden. Yet even with that revelation, the deeper layers remain buried, waiting for us to look closer. There is a unique stillness that descends upon suburban California as the sun finally relinquishes its hold, leaving streets bathed in the fading glow of golden light. At first glance, the neighborhoods appear serene, meticulously maintained, almost idyllic, stretching in perfect lines of driveways, trimmed hedges, and sidewalks worn smooth by decades of pedestrian traffic. Yet beneath this veneer of calm lies a quiet, almost imperceptible tension. It begins subtly, a fleeting hesitation before switching off the porch light, a lingering awareness that someone may be observing from beyond the boundaries of familiar routines. This feeling, often dismissed as imagination, quietly grows into a shadow that seeps into daily life, unseen yet undeniably present. During the late 1970s, California prided itself on projecting comfort and security. Families invested in suburban homes, believing they offered a safe haven from urban unpredictability. Front lawns hosted parents chatting while children played freely, a scene of everyday normalcy that reassured residents of their carefully constructed safety. But serenity is fragile, especially when night falls. The shadows stretch and deepen, transforming familiar streets into corridors of uncertainty. Silence, once peaceful, becomes a kind of waiting breath, a prelude to the unforeseen, an alert to unseen observers. Within these communities lived individuals whose lives were ordinary yet filled with quiet aspirations. One young nurse worked long shifts, known for her patience and calm demeanor, keeping a neatly folded list of future travels tucked in her diary. A male teacher, in his early 30s, adored by students for his dedication, followed morning routines of dawn runs and small personal rituals. Their lives were grounded in hope, rooted in structure, and framed by ambition. They exemplified the ordinary human desire for stability, progress, and fulfillment. In the months preceding their deaths, these victims shared an unsettling commonality, a sense of being watched. Minor, seemingly insignificant occurrences, a rustling sound near a backyard fence, a vehicle idling with headlights off, or fleeting glimpses of a stranger accumulated into an unacknowledged intuition. Yet these premonitions were largely ignored, rationalized away. Humans often refuse to confront vague threats. The mind prefers comfort over suspicion until danger acquires a name. Among these quiet neighborhoods were men whose presence, in hindsight, suggested latent menace. A shy warehouse worker, prone to irritation over trivial matters, moved through life with a disquieting tension. A handyman wandered streets at odd hours, citing insomnia but leaving neighbors uneasy. Another individual remained socially withdrawn, speaking little, observing more. On the surface, none appeared overtly dangerous, yet subtle indicators prolonged eye contact. Abrupt emotional shifts or unusual reactions hinted at internal disturbances. Psychologists later identified these micro-behaviors as potential markers of emerging antisocial tendencies, fragments of a psychological profile taking shape in the shadows. The fabric of suburban life concealed pressures that intensified these hidden tensions. Communities outwardly appeared tight-knit, yet beneath polite greetings and manicured lawns lay marital strife, personal rivalries, and concealed emotional burdens. Social expectation enforced perfection, isolating those who struggled privately. Depression, financial stress, and unvoiced resentment quietly fermented, providing fertile ground for destructive impulses. It is often within these structured, controlled environments that trauma and latent aggression find space to grow. Hidden beneath routines and appearances, the calm, the order, and the trust in everyday life ironically became a mask, shielding not only the ordinary but also the dangerous from view. Within outwardly peaceful streets, unseen threats moved with deliberate subtlety. Everyday habits, the placement of furniture, the pattern of lights, the rhythm of routines, became an unwitting map for anyone trained to read vulnerability. The order meant to provide safety transformed into a system that could be quietly exploited, allowing an observer to blend into the background. Shadows, physical and psychological, overlapped, turning familiar spaces into terrain where danger could hide in plain sight. The neighborhood's design deepened this concealment. Privacy fences, hedges, and dim side yards created pockets where movement vanished into darkness. Small sounds were easily dismissed. Comfort unintentionally became cover. Predictable routines further exposed residents. Their consistent schedules made it simple to know when someone was home, alone, or distracted. In its structure and trust, suburban life created blind spot spaces where an unseen presence could watch, wait, and remain undetected. Understanding the psychological atmosphere of the late 1970s is essential. It was a period marked by rising anxiety, uncertainty, cultural shifts, and an increasing fear of crime formed a constant background hum that many preferred not to acknowledge. Beneath the outward optimism of expanding suburbs lay a growing sense of disillusionment. Some residents retreated inward, while others sought control in darker, more harmful ways. This emotional tension created conditions in which someone driven by domination or violent validation could quietly take root. In the months before the attacks escalated, people noticed subtle changes in their neighborhoods. Dogs barked more often after dark, curtains closed earlier, outdoor conversations shortened. Fear does not announce itself. It spreads through intuition, revealing patterns before logic can understand them. Several victims felt this unease but could not name its source. Ironically, the same qualities that made suburban California desirable, its calm, its consistency, its polite distance, also enabled a predator to move unnoticed. The illusion of safety softened instincts, and the comfort of community fostered blind trust. In exploiting these foundations, the killer targeted not just individuals, but an entire system built on the belief that danger lived elsewhere. This illusion of safety shaped the case from the start. Neighbors who heard disturbances chose not to investigate. Witnesses who noticed odd behavior dismissed it. Loved ones who sensed unease reassured themselves instead of reacting. When people believe their world is safe, they reinterpret danger as coincidence, creating a community vulnerable, precisely because it trusts its own security. To understand the victims, one must understand this environment. Their routines, expectations, relationships, and daily rhythms formed the stage long before the crimes occurred. They were ordinary people in an ordinary setting, unaware that someone had been quietly studying their lives. In the end, the shadows moving through suburban California were more than darkness. They were layers of secrets, overlooked habits, and an unseen presence passing silently between homes, forming a pattern of terror that would soon extend far beyond a single neighborhood. In the days before each attack, a quiet pattern stirred beneath the surface, subtle enough to ignore, yet unmistakable in hindsight. People moved through their routines, unaware that every small habit was being observed. These moments seemed harmless then, but later formed a faint disruption in the rhythm of normal life. Something was circling just beyond familiarity, waiting for vigilance to fade. One victim, a nurse returning from long shifts, kept her porch light on longer than usual and paused outside as if sensing an unnamed presence. Another victim, a young teacher, mentioned the unsettling feeling of someone lingering near his yard after dark, and unease neither could explain. Investigators would later realize these early signs were part of a calculated stalking pattern, carried out with chilling precision. The killer did not act on impulse. He studied routines, tracked lights, watched windows, and learned the intimate rhythm of each household. His talent for blending into suburban quiet made him nearly invisible. As each crime approached, the environment seemed to change. Streetlights flickered without cause, dogs barked at empty yards, and homes felt unnaturally still. One resident heard footsteps near her garage the night before a nearby murder. Another recalled a heavy, unnatural silence settling over the neighborhood before dawn. When night settled, the neighborhood changed. California's warm glow sank into muted shadows, turning familiar streets into a maze of thinning sound and sharpened instinct. In that darkness moved someone who knew every window, every vulnerable moment. Between midnight and 3 a.m., residents dismissed small noises because unnamed danger feels unreal. The killer understood this terrain intimately. He moved in silence, letting the natural acoustics of the neighborhood swallow his footsteps. At that hour, sound behaved differently, absorbed rather than echoed, while shadows gathered in corners untouched by streetlights. Nothing in the environment protected the residents. The limits of human perception did the work for him. By the time awareness stirred, it was already too late. In several attacks, his entry points revealed careful preparation: a gate left loosely latched, a sliding window with a weakened lock, a garage door not fully shut. These were not acts of carelessness, but everyday habits, small, harmless oversights that turned into openings for someone intent on exploiting them. The events inside the homes remain mostly reconstructed through partial evidence and the aftermath left behind. The details do not need to be ascribed to understand the emotional rupture they caused. What mattered was the suffocating atmosphere that investigators reported. Overturned objects that suggested an internal struggle, interrupted routines, frozen in place, and traces of panic captured in the position of a chair, a torn fabric, or a dropped personal item. The scenes whispered of fear but not of clarity. Across multiple incidents, one disquieting detail recurred. Neighbors later admitted hearing something: a muffled thump, a short cry, or an unusual silence, but they hesitated to act. Fear often immobilizes before it motivates. People convince themselves that intervening might be intrusive or unnecessary. The psychology of bystander hesitation is complex, rooted in a desire to avoid misinterpreting a situation. In this case, hesitation allowed the killer to vanish before anyone acknowledged the danger. The hours immediately following each attack carried a sense of rupture that spread through the neighborhood. A roommate returned home and sensed instantly that something felt wrong, though the house appeared untouched at first glance. A parent found an empty bedroom and assumed their child had left early, only to uncover the truth moments later. These discoveries created an emotional shock that investigators described as the moment silence becomes unbearable. Police arrived to scenes marked by confusion, grief, and the lingering scent of fear. Officers attempted to piece together the sequence of events, but the absence of witnesses made reconstruction difficult. Strange behaviors from certain individuals complicated the process. One neighbor avoided eye contact when questioned. Another provided a timeline that shifted with each retelling. A third claimed to have slept through the night, despite evidence suggesting he was awake during the critical hours. What troubled investigators most was the presence of evidence that felt wrong. A footprint that should have been clear was oddly blurred. A household item appeared in a place that defied logic. A street-facing camera stopped recording minutes before the attack. Alone, each detail meant little together. They formed a map of unanswered questions. The most crucial clues surfaced later. One scene revealed a partial shoe print inconsistent with the home's flooring. Another featured a witness whose height estimate contradicted earlier profiles. And in one case, a trace of biological material matched no one in the household, hinting at an intruder long overlooked. That mismatched DNA would later become the thread that unraveled decades of uncertainty. But at the time, it created more confusion than clarity. Investigators found themselves confronting a possibility that disturbed their earlier conclusions. The crimes did not align with any known pattern of domestic conflict, burglary gone wrong, or interpersonal motive. The evidence pointed toward a perpetrator who acted with calculated detachment, unaffected by emotional ties to the victims. The question that surfaced at the end of this stage of the investigation was simple yet profound. Was this truly an isolated tragedy? Or was it part of something larger? Something no one had recognized yet. The inconsistencies, the silence, the shadows, and the DNA all suggested that the case was not merely unusual. It was the beginning of a realization that the community's understanding of danger had been incomplete. In that moment, investigators realized they were no longer trying to explain a single night's events. They had stepped into a maze built over years, perhaps decades, and somewhere deep inside it, someone had been waiting, shielded by darkness that had always favored him. Confusion slowly hardened into dread. The turning point came not from a witness, but from a trace of genetic materials, more accidental, yet impossible to ignore. It suggested a truth no one wanted to face. The killer had been among them all along, moving unnoticed through their lives. The fragment offered no name yet, but it overturned every assumption. It left investigators with one question: was this a crime, more the work of a predator, far more deliberate than anyone imagined? From the moment the investigation began, detectives found themselves confronting not only a lack of clear evidence, but also the growing weight of expectation. Each carefully preserved crime scene carried the hope of revealing a single thread that could unravel the mystery. Yet every promising lead dissolved under closer scrutiny. Minor oversights, conflicting witness statements, and ambiguous traces gradually formed a maze of uncertainty. It soon became clear that this was not a case shaped by simple cause and effect. Something far more deliberate was guiding its progression. At first, investigators relied on standard procedures, photographing scenes, collecting fingerprints, interviewing neighbors. Yet the most ordinary details slipped past unnoticed: a slightly bent window latch, footprints blurred by rain, objects sitting just out of place. These elements seemed insignificant at the time, but they later exposed how thoroughly the perpetrator had studied each environment, turning everyday familiarity into a perfect disguise for his calculated movements. Suspects were questioned in steady succession: warehouse employees, neighbors, casual acquaintances, even former partners. Each was asked to account for their movements, yet the responses were as varied as they were inconclusive. Some offered alibis riddled with uncertainty, while others spoke with a polished precision that seemed almost too perfect. Still, none provided the contradiction investigators needed. It soon became evident that the perpetrator operated with a level of subtlety that allowed him to slip effortlessly beneath traditional investigative frameworks. Though the police cast a wide net, their target blended so seamlessly into daily life that no one stood out. Public pressure quickly compounded the difficulty. Newspapers portrayed the unknown assailant as a ghost in the suburbs, a predator moving through calm California streets with chilling ease. Rumor hardened into supposed fact, redirecting attention and fueling collective anxiety. For grieving families, the relentless spotlight deepened their suffering, forcing them to navigate both loss and unwanted public fascination. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, investigators developed several hypotheses. The first hypothesis focused on personal motives. Could these crimes stem from resentment, jealousy, or long-held vendettas? Investigators examined the victims' relationships, looking for conflicts that might have escalated into violence. But while some personal tensions existed, none aligned with the pattern or consistency of the intrusions. Hypothesis B suggested that the scenes might have been staged. Perhaps the perpetrator manipulated environments intentionally to mislead investigators. In this view, the crime scenes were constructed performances, using misdirection to obscure the true nature of the crimes. Some detectives believed the unusual placement of objects or the strange disruptions in household routines reflected deliberate attempts to rewrite the story of each attack. According to this theory, every detail of the mundane held potential meaning. Hypothesis C, however, unsettled investigators the most. It proposed the presence of a third party, entirely unsuspected, someone who had seamlessly integrated into the community. This individual lived among neighbors, attended local events, exchanged polite greetings, and never attracted suspicion. The apparent randomness of victim selection then was not random at all, it was camouflaged. By blending into the ordinary flow of suburban life, the perpetrator avoided detection, not through physical invisibility, but through psychological familiarity. Under this hypothesis, fear was not merely emotional, it was evidence of the offender's skill. While these theories guided the investigation, they also complicated it. None fully explained the case, and each left gaps too large to ignore. Detectives were forced to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously, a mental balancing act that exhausted resources and fractured internal consensus. The case stretched from weeks into months, then years, and ultimately decades, carrying with it an aura of unsolved dread. Media involvement, meanwhile, shaped public perception in powerful ways. Inaccurate reporting sometimes solidified into community truths, requiring investigators and families alike to correct narratives that took on a life of their own. The moniker, "The Invisible Threat," emerged from these stories, evocative but misleading description that reflected more collective fear than investigative insight. Throughout the 1980s, investigators revisited the evidence repeatedly. Advances in forensic sciences, especially in trace material analysis, breathed new life into old clues. A biological sample once considered too degraded could now be examined with greater precision. But even with new methods, the case remained stubbornly opaque. The breakthrough that would eventually identify the killer through DNA did not yet exist. Forensic possibilities were limited. Many samples were too small, too contaminated, or too old to produce definitive results. Psychologists attempted to contribute through early offender profiling. They described a personality defined by patience, meticulous attention to detail, emotional detachment, and an intense desire for control. These assessments, though informative, were speculative. Human psychology is expansive, and even trained experts acknowledged that their predictions could not fully anticipate the complexity of the perpetrator's inner world. Still, these profiles helped narrow the focus to behavioral consistencies, an attempt to map the mind behind the pattern. As time passed, the community became part of the case itself. Residents altered routines, reinforced locks, installed lighting, and formed neighborhood watch groups. Yet even these protective measures highlighted the invisible fractures beneath suburban calm. The relationship between environment, habit, and threat became central to understanding how the crimes unfolded. The killer's ability to exploit predictable human behavior revealed a chilling interplay between personal vulnerability and environmental design. The first true breakthrough came decades later, not from testimony or confession, but from a single fragment of DNA carefully preserved and long overlooked. When modern analysis finally revealed its significance, it dismantled earlier assumptions and forced investigators to reevaluate every theory they had once considered. Personal motives, staged scenes, outside involvement all were reframed under the weight of scientific certainty. But solving identity was only the beginning. The deeper questions, the why, the psychological triggers, the meaning behind the pattern remained elusive. The darkness that had drifted through suburban California resisted simple explanation. Even confronted with the truth, investigators were left with the unsettling realization that knowledge does not always bring understanding. In the end, the decades-long hunt uncovered more than a concealed predator. It revealed the limits of human perception, the vulnerability of ordinary habits, and the patience of someone willing to exploit them. Yet it also proved that relentless investigation can pierce even the deepest silence, allowing truth to finally emerge. The moment DNA confirmed the identity of the perpetrator in 2018, decades of silence and uncertainty transformed into a singular clarity. Yet clarity did not bring comfort. It brought questions. Questions about the psychology that had driven such precise, repeated acts of violence. Questions about how a human being could navigate normal life while harboring such deep, concealed darkness. Understanding the mind behind the crimes required more than legal evidence. It required reflection on trauma, compulsion, and morality. Psychologists observed a clear pattern in the offender's behavior. He exercised deliberate, calculated control over both environment and victim. This control resembled fixation rather than opportunism. His actions were not impulsive displays of anger, but carefully planned demonstrations of dominance. He mapped routines, exploited weaknesses, and acted only when conditions favored invisibility, revealing a mind trained to minimize risk while maximizing psychological effect. Developmentally, early experiences likely influenced this trajectory. Isolation, rejection, or conflict may have warped his moral compass. Empathy seemed diminished, replaced by a need for control consistent with trauma-based patterns where unresolved wounds translate into destructive behavior. Stoic philosophy offers one lens through which to understand this compulsion. Stoicism emphasizes self-mastery and reflection on internal states. Yet when misapplied or internalized through rigid and maladaptive patterns, it can lead to detachment from moral responsibility. The offender's careful, calculated behavior demonstrates mastery of physical circumstance. But without ethical grounding, such control becomes a tool for exploitation rather than virtue. Similarly, Buddhist perspectives on attachment and suffering illuminate subtle dimensions. Unprocessed attachments or aversions can accumulate as inner unrest. If redirected destructively, this energy may manifest in acts that impose suffering externally. In this case, the killer's ability to observe, manipulate, and intrude into others' lives could be interpreted as a maladaptive attempt to manage inner dissatisfaction or trauma, externalized in lethal ways. Even after identification, the offender's motives remained partly opaque. DNA revealed identity, not intent. Investigators could trace physical movement and methodical planning, yet the psychological calculus, the reasoning behind each target selection, remained partially speculative. Were these acts purely about control, a need for recognition, or the projection of unresolved anger onto seemingly innocent lives? Each possibility offered insight but no definitive answer. Communities impacted by the crimes continued to wrestle with aftershocks. Survivors, family members, and neighbors lived with an enduring sense of vulnerability. The knowledge that the predator had moved unseen among them intensified a collective reflection on the nature of safety and perception. Ordinary routines that once felt secure became reminders of fragility, evidence that appearances are unreliable shields against hidden realities. The social consequences of delayed justice are far-reaching. Prolonged uncertainty deepens grief, erodes trust, and weakens the bonds that hold communities together. In the search for closure, suspicion can drift toward the innocent, creating fractures that linger long after facts emerge. Even with DNA confirming the offender's identity, emotional recovery remained uneven and incomplete. Criminologically, the offender's mindset reflects the convergence of opportunity, patience, and predisposition. His long evasion points to sharp situational awareness and an ability to read routines, exploit blind spots, and operate along psychological patterns invisible to most people. Biological confirmation of guilt resolves only part of the deeper ethical and philosophical questions surrounding the case. From a Stoic or Buddhist perspective, the crimes reflect a profound failure to cultivate virtue or transform suffering into empathy. From a secular psychological view, they illustrate how unaddressed trauma, combined with opportunity, can manifest as extreme antisocial behavior. In every framework, the events expose the vulnerability of moral and social systems when confronted with deliberate malice. For investigators and psychologists, the outcome offers both clarity and lingering uncertainty. DNA evidence confirms identity, yet it also sharpens the enduring questions: why these victims? Why this methodology? And how the offender remained unseen for so long. Unanswered questions highlight the limits of perception and foresight. Even with exhaustive investigation, communities often overlook the subtle patterns that signal predatory behavior. People depend on familiar mental shortcuts to navigate daily life. Yet these shortcuts can be manipulated by someone who understands social norms and psychological tendencies more deeply than the average person. This tension between ordinary perception and exceptional criminal awareness underscores why the case continues to resonate. The consequences reach beyond individual victims, shaping broader conversations about trust, safety, and the predictability of human behavior. Such cases challenge assumptions about the security of routine life, revealing how easily calculated intent can infiltrate familiar environments. They offer a lens through which to examine the fragile balance between freedom, trust, and hidden potential within human nature. Ethically, the case underscores that identification is not the same as understanding. DNA established identity, but not motive. The psychological landscape remains partly uncharted, reminding scholars and observers alike that some aspects of human behavior may forever resist full comprehension. Communities, investigators, and psychologists must now navigate a space where certainty and uncertainty coexist. Although the name behind decades of fear is finally known, the deeper narrative shaped by suffering, compulsion, and human choice continues to unfold in the minds of those trying to understand it. True understanding arises not only from factual revelation, but from ongoing reflection on human behavior and its complexities. The central lesson revealed at this stage is the intricate relationship between science and psychology. DNA offers undeniable confirmation of identity, yet full comprehension requires more than scientific proof. It demands the integration of observation, behavioral insight, and philosophical consideration. Events like these sit at the intersection of evidence and interpretation, of measurable fact and moral reasoning. Clarity illuminates certain truths, but others remain obscured, layered within the unseen motivations of the human mind. Even after decades of uncertainty and the eventual identification of the offender, the narrative of the victims, their families, and the affected communities endures. Their resilience reflects the strength of ordinary people confronting extraordinary hardship. The case also highlights the delicate psychological balance that shapes communal life and how easily it can be disrupted by deliberate harm. Ultimately, a difficult question persists. Does a crime end with identification, or does it continue in the lingering echoes of memory and consequence? The answer is complex, shaped by justice, healing, and the human need to find meaning within suffering. Even with the truth uncovered, its reverberations remain challenging, unsettling, and instructive. Time often gives the illusion of healing, yet the fear embedded in these events is more than a passing shadow. Fear acts as a mirror, reflecting not only what is outside, but also the hidden recesses of our own minds. This unsolved mystery, stretching across decades, reminds us that the most unsettling truths are sometimes those we refuse to face within ourselves. The perpetrator may be identified, yet the psychological echoes of their actions linger, challenging communities, investigators, and individuals alike. Lessons emerge quietly. Vigilance is as much about awareness as it is about understanding human behavior. Ordinary routines can conceal extraordinary danger. Silence can harbor truth, and the absence of evidence does not equate to the absence of reality. These are truths that demand reflection, caution, and a steady mind. If this story captured your attention, please like, share, and subscribe to support our channel. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.